Have you ever stopped to wonder if the people living in a land today are, the direct descendants of those who were there thousands of years ago? It's a question that carries, immense weight in a place like the Levant.
Oh, absolutely. Especially with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right? Understanding historical roots there is so politically charged.
Exactly. Narratives of origin are just such powerful tools in this enduring conflict.
They really are. Both Israelis and Palestinians connect themselves to the history, the long history of the land, using everything from ancient texts to archaeology.
So getting a clearer picture of the actual sort of historical connections feels vital.
And that's where this really game-changing field has emerged, ancient DNA analysis.
Right. Imagine being able to reach back thousands of years into the genetic code of people from antiquity. It's incredible.
And over the last decade, say 2017 to 2025 roughly, scientists have made just unbelievable progress.
And what's compelling is the focus on the Levant, right? Specifically the southern Levant, modern Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Jordan.
Precisely. It's been such a crossroads for millennia, and this ancient DNA is helping us piece together the really intricate story of how people moved and related to each other there.
Okay, so today on the deep dive, our mission, if you will, is to explore what this cutting-edge genetic research tells us about the ancestry of modern populations there, with a keen focus on the Palestinians, obviously.
Yeah. We're looking at studies that have analyzed DNA from ancient Canaanite remains.
From those important Bronze Age sites, like Ashdod, Ashkelon, Tel Megiddo.
Exactly, Lachish too, dating back roughly 3,500 to 1,200 BCE, and then comparing that DNA to people living in the Levant today.
So we're asking, can we actually find direct genetic links that go beyond the historical accounts?
What do the genes themselves tell us about the relationship between modern populations and these ancient Canaanites? That's the core question.
And the findings. Well, they're pretty remarkable, aren't they?
They really are. Strong evidence of genetic continuity, but also these fascinating insights into how different populations mixed over time.
And maybe, surprisingly, how little some major invasions actually changed the underlying genetics.
That's a big part of it, yeah. Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start with the genetic signature of the Canaanites themselves.
Sounds good. What's the main picture?
So, a key takeaway, really from multiple studies, is this significant genetic thread connecting the ancient Canaanites to most modern Arab and Jewish groups in the Levant.
Suggesting a much deeper shared ancestry than maybe some narratives emphasize.
Exactly, a deep regional ancestry.
And what really jumps out is that link with modern Lebanese population.
Oh, definitely. Some research points to over 90% shared ancestry between ancient Canaanites and modern Lebanese. It's very direct.
90%, wow.
It is. Now, it's important to grasp that the Canaanites themselves weren't, some single isolated group.
Right, they were already mixed.
Yes, their genetic makeup was a blend. You had local populations already there from the Neolithic period. And then you had this significant influx of migrants from the Zagros Mountains region, that's modern-day Iran, the Caucasus area. And they arrived during the Neolithic and Bronze Ages. This later group, the Bronze Age migrants, actually contributed over half of the Canaanite DNA.
Over half. So the Canaanites we think of were already fundamentally a mix of local Levantine and Zagros Caucasus people.
That's the picture genetics paints.
Does that connect with anything archaeologists have found on the ground?
It does, quite neatly, actually. Think about that distinctive Khirbet-Karak pottery.
Oh yeah, I've heard of that.
It originated up in the Caucasus region and is found at various Canaanite sites. So you have this material evidence of contact, maybe migration. And now the genetic data backs it up, showing a really significant ancestral contribution from that northern area.
Okay, so the Canaanites were mixed. Now, what about all those later groups? The Egyptians, Assyrians, Greeks, Romans, Arabs, Crusaders, Ottomans, a long list. Surely they left a big genetic mark.
Well, here's where it gets really interesting and maybe counterintuitive. Despite this whole history of conquests and migrations, the genetic studies consistently show that these events often had a surprisingly limited and sort of unsustainable impact on the core genetic structure of the people living there.
Limited. Even with massive empires moving in.
It seems so. It looks like while cultures, languages, political systems, they could change dramatically.
Yeah.
Large-scale replacements of the existing population just weren't the norm. More cultural and political shifts than population swaps, generally speaking.
Okay, give us an example. What about the Arab-Islamic conquest in the 7th century? Huge cultural and linguistic shift, right?
A perfect example. Monumental changes culturally, linguistically. The spread of Arabic is immense.
Yeah.
But the genetic evidence suggests it didn't cause a major genetic upheaval across the Levant.
Really? Why might that be?
Well, one theory is that the number of initial Arab conquerors might have been relatively small compared to the large local population. So over time, yes, there was intermingling, new genetic elements came in, but the fundamental Levantine genetic makeup seems to have remained largely consistent.
It does make you rethink the scale of some of these historical shifts, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It challenges the idea of complete population replacement with every conquest.
Okay, what about a group like the European Crusaders? They were there for a couple of centuries. Did they leave a lasting genetic trace?
Another good case study, research on ancient DNA from that period does show a temporary genetic impact.
Temporary.
Yes. You see Southern European genetic markers pop up in the Levant during the 12th and 13th centuries, likely linked to the Crusaders.
Okay, makes sense.
But crucially, those markers largely fade away in later populations.
Ah, so they were absorbed.
Seems like it. Suggests the Crusaders and their descendants were eventually assimilated into the local gene pool. It was more of a transient genetic blip than a permanent transformation of the population's core ancestry.
That's fascinating. This idea of limited long-term genetic impact despite major historical events is really quite eye-opening.
It really is.
Okay, let's zoom in on a specific group often mentioned, the Philistines, famously associated with the southern coast, right?
Yeah.
What does genetics tell us about them?
Yes, the Philistines, often identified with the Sea Peoples, who appear around 1200 BCE, right around the Late Bronze Age collapse. And a really significant study came out in 2019 looking at ancient DNA from a Philistine cemetery in Ashkelon, one of their main cities. Very informative.
Okay, Ashkelon, what did they find?
They found a clear Southern European genetic component in the earliest Philistine samples from the early Iron Age.
Southern European, so like Aegean, Greece, Crete maybe?
Exactly, suggesting a migration from the Aegean region around the 12th century BCE, which aligns pretty well with some historical and archaeological ideas about their origins.
So they were newcomers,
Yeah.
genetically distinct initially.
Initially, yes. But, and this is the crucial bit, this European genetic signature turned out to be pretty temporary.
Like the Crusaders.
Sort of, but maybe even more pronounced assimilation. While it was noticeable in the very early Philistine samples from Ashkelon, its prevalence dropped off rapidly in later Philistine individuals.
So they mixed with the locals.
Very strongly suggests that, yes, the initial Philistine migrants intermarried and integrated with the local Canaanite population.
So unlike the big empires just passing through and leaving a limited mark, the Philistines show a different pattern. Initial distinction, then assimilation.
Precisely. A really clear case of admixture and assimilation.
And how quickly did this happen?
Apparently quite fast, geologically speaking. By the 10th century BCE, so maybe a couple of hundred years later, the genetic difference between people identified as Philistines and the local Canaanites had become very difficult to detect.
Wow. Genetically, they'd largely merged.
Seems that way. It's a really compelling example of how a new group can become integrated into an existing population through intermarriage, sometimes over a relatively short time frame.
That really is a powerful illustration of genetic assimilation. Okay, so we've looked at the Canaanites, later rivals like the Philistines. Let's bring it back to the present.
Right.
Modern populations in the Levant, Palestinians, Lebanese, others. What do their genes tell us about their connection to these ancient groups? How do scientists even figure this out?
Good question. They use a whole toolkit of sophisticated genetic analysis methods. You hear terms like PCA, principal component analysis.
Vaguely. We mix like a map, right?
Sort of, yeah. It helps visualize how different populations cluster based on genetic similarities. Then there's admixture analysis.
Right.
That helps estimate the proportions of ancestry from different ancient or source populations within individuals or groups today. Plus other statistical tools like F-statistics, QPADM. They all help trace these genetic threads.
So these are the methods that let us see these links across thousands of years.
That's the idea. And when you apply these methods comparing ancient Canaanite DNA with DNA from modern Levantines, the consistent finding is that modern Levantines,
Including Palestinians and Lebanese.
yes, including Palestinians and Lebanese, share a significant portion of their genetic makeup with those ancient Canaanites.
Suggesting real genetic continuity, despite everything that happened in between.
Exactly, a continuity that persists through millennia of migrations and cultural shifts.
That feels like the real heart of the matter, doesn't it? this persistent genetic link.
It really does. A study from 2020, for instance, indicated that the genetic makeup of Levantine Arabs and Jews today gets about half of its, quote, ancient Levantine component from the Bronze Age and earlier.
So basically from Canaanite and pre-Canaanite populations.
That's the interpretation, yes. The other half includes later contributions, things like Arabian ancestry, some smaller European influences, maybe some Turkish or Central Asian elements mixed in over time.
So later additions are definitely there, but that ancient Levantine foundation is still substantial, around half.
Absolutely. It's a major component. And again, it's worth highlighting the Lebanese population.
Right, the 90% figure.
They consistently show the highest proportion of this ancient Canaanite-related ancestry. Likely factors include the geography, the isolation of Mount Lebanon, maybe periods of less direct rule limiting extensive admixture from outside.
Makes sense. What about the Palestinians specifically? Where do the estimates land for their Canaanite ancestry?
For modern Palestinians and also Jordanians, the estimates generally suggest that on average, somewhere around 50 to 70% of their ancestry traces back to these Canaanite and earlier Levantine populations.
50 to 70%. That's still the majority component.
It is. And interestingly, this proportion often seems to be even higher in more traditional villages and rural areas.
Suggesting maybe stronger preservation of that older genetic heritage away from the main migration crossroads.
That's a plausible interpretation, yeah. More isolated communities might retain older genetic signals more strongly.
Okay. Now, one aspect of this research that always gets talked about is the genetic similarity often found between Palestinians and Jews. How do we understand that, especially given the conflict?
It is a striking finding and maybe seems paradoxical on the surface, but it actually reinforces this core idea of a shared ancient Levantine heritage.
How so?
Because both groups draw significantly from that same ancient ancestral source population. Their more recent genetic divergence comes later.
Due to things like migrations, religious divisions leading to marrying mostly within their own communities.
Exactly. Those factors created distinct paths over time. But research, for example, on Y chromosomes passed down the male line, shows significant overlap between many Palestinians and Jews, pointing to a common Middle Eastern genetic pool that predates their religious separation by thousands of years.
So at a deep genetic level, there's this significant shared ancestry, even between groups who are currently in profound conflict.
That's what the genetics seem to show.
Which brings us squarely to the socio-political implications. This is where it gets really complex, right?
Yeah.
How are these genetic insights being used or interpreted?
Oh, absolutely. It's unavoidable. These findings inevitably intersect with the historical narratives and identity claims of both Palestinians and Israelis.
So for Palestinians, how might this be seen?
Well, for Palestinians, this scientific evidence can be seen as really strengthening their connection to the land. It provides, tangible support for the idea of deep historical roots. It challenges narratives that sometimes portray them as more recent arrivals, perhaps linked mainly to their Arab conquests or later migrations. Remember, Yasser Arafat even referenced Canaanite ancestry.
So it adds a scientific layer to a long-held sense of connection.
It can be framed that way, yes. On the other hand, some Israelis, or supporters of certain Israeli narratives, might interpret these findings differently. They might emphasize the continuity between Canaanites and ancient Israelites, perhaps suggesting that everyone in the region shares this heritage, thereby potentially downplaying a unique Palestinian link.
So the argument becomes, if many groups share this ancestry, maybe the modern distinctions are less rooted in ancient times.
That's one possible interpretation, yes. It highlights how the same genetic data can be selectively emphasized to support different existing viewpoints.
It sounds like a minefield, using genetics in this context.
It is. And it's so crucial to stress that genetics tells us about ancestry, biological relatedness. It doesn't automatically define national identity, cultural identity, political rights.
Or erase historical grievances.
Absolutely not. Those are real lived experiences and political realities that genetics doesn't just wipe away. There's a real danger in misusing genetic data for racial or exclusionary arguments.
Let's then. Could there be a flip side? Could this knowledge maybe foster a sense of shared history, promote some understanding?
That's the hope, perhaps. You look at Lebanon again, genetic studies showing similarities across different religious groups there. That kind of scientific evidence can subtly highlight a shared past beneath the current divisions. Maybe encourage a bit more tolerance, a sense of common Levantine heritage.
And maybe within the Palestinian community itself, could acknowledging deeper Canaanite roots alongside Arab identity be useful?
Potentially, yes. It could contribute to a richer, more layered understanding of their own history and identity, embracing both the ancient Levantine and the later Arab cultural and linguistic dimensions.
What about the counter-argument you sometimes hear that Canaanite identity is extinct, so it's irrelevant?
Well, that argument tends to overlook significant continuities beyond just genetics. Think about language. Arabic itself has Semitic roots related to ancient Canaanite languages.
Sure.
Many place names in the region have very ancient origins, possibly Canaanite. Folk traditions, agricultural practices, some might have threads going way back.
And genetically?
Genetically, while you do see evidence of later European admixture in some Jewish populations, particularly Ashkenazi Jews,
Right.
the studies we're talking about often show a very strong, direct genetic link between Palestinians, Lebanese, other Eastern Mediterranean groups, and the ancient Canaanite Levantine populations. It suggests a more geographically anchored continuity for many.
So it comes back to identity being this really complex mix, right? Genetics, culture, language, lived experience, not just DNA.
Absolutely. Genetics gives us this incredible window into ancestry, but identity is far broader, far more dynamic. It's shaped by history, belief, community, personal choice.
Okay, so let's try to summarize the main conclusion here. What's the key takeaway regarding Palestinians and the ancient Canaanites from all this genetic research?
I think the primary conclusion, bringing together multiple studies, is that modern Palestinians are, in large part, descended from the ancient Canaanites and other Bronze Age Levantine peoples. Subsequent migrations and intermingling definitely happened, adding layers to that ancestral foundation, but they didn't fundamentally erase or replace it.
So the Canaanites didn't just vanish.
The genetic evidence, backed by archaeology too, strongly argues against that. Their genetic heritage clearly persists significantly in the people living in the Levant today, including Palestinians.
And this obviously has wider implications for understanding the whole region's history.
Definitely. It deepens our understanding of the origins of the Palestinian people, yes, but also the population of the Levant more broadly. It reveals this shared ancient heritage.
Shared with other groups in the region, including Jews.
Yes, a heritage stretching back thousands of years, underlying some of the more recent divisions.
So while it's obviously not a magic bullet for solving political conflicts,
Far from it.
this shared ancestry, this scientific finding, could it offer a different perspective? Maybe challenge some narratives?
It has that potential, I think. It can challenge exclusionary arguments that try to deny the deep historical connections people have to this land. It can emphasize the common humanity, the shared deep roots that lie beneath the current very real divisions.
Recognizing it doesn't fix things, but it adds a layer of understanding.
Exactly. It can contribute to a more informed, maybe more nuanced conversation about the history and the people of this incredibly significant region.
This has been a truly fascinating deep dive. It really shows the power of genetics to shed light on our shared and sometimes contested past.
It's a rapidly evolving field with profound implications.
Makes you think about those enduring connections, doesn't it? Across time, across divides that seem